some advice on how to negotiate with vendors in your managed services practice. This topic on today's MSP Zone.
You're entering the MSP Zone, a podcast for the managed services community, covering news, analysis, and interviews from around the globe. Elevate your MSP game by staying in the MSP Zone. And now, your host, Charles Weaver.
More and more MSPs are in the middle of negotiations with their vendors, both new and existing. And we're seeing some interesting trends out there about what the MSPs are going through and lessons learned. And for those of you who may be new to the managed services profession, maybe you are also in the middle of negotiations with some of your vendors and you could benefit from some advice, some shared wisdom from your colleagues out there around the world. You've come to the right place on today's MSP Zone, because that's exactly what we're going to be talking about. And we have our old friend, Rob Scott, back on the program. Rob, you there?
I'm here, Charles. Good to be with you.
It is good. So good to have you on the program again and hear your voice. How are things in Texas?
Texas is open for business, baby. Things are feeling a lot more like pre-COVID, the good and the bad, including lots of traffic jams. Hard to get a reservation at a good restaurant because they're all full. You go to try to get some new clothes. The tailor in the clothing store tells you we're backed up for a month. So maybe some supply issues in Texas, but we're definitely open for business.
Well, good to hear. And it's good for the MSPs as well, because that means more business, more managed services demand. So let's dive right into today's topic. I know you work a lot with MSPs on contract review when it comes to working with some of their vendors. A lot of them, some of the bigger ones that people would know. But we seem to be having maybe a trend. I think it's a trend when you hear definitely a group of MSPs from different areas all saying the same thing or relatively similar things, which are there's a pricing and a competition and a movement of, let's say, the big four MSP platform companies are moving in a consistent area. And I would characterize it as they're having kind of a war, right? The four of those companies are in a race to beat each other out of the market or to gain market share at the expense of those other competitors. And then you've got everybody else in the vendor space, vendor meaning vendors who sell to the MSPs. And I think that they could be unwitting beneficiaries of this MSP platform war, because they could actually come out looking better than the big four companies on a number of fronts. And that's where, Rob, I want to get your thought on the first topic, which is you have long advocated for an equal distribution of risk amongst vendor, MSP, and customer. Do you believe, I've asked you this question before, but I'm asking it again. Do you believe that the MSP has the capability to, if they wield it, negotiate a fair, equitable distribution of that risk with their vendors, hardware, software, services vendors, doesn't matter?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. And if you can't, you should keep shopping. Because particularly for the MSP, they're trying to make money. Undue risk is not going to help you make money. And, the MSP, needs to operate in what I refer to as the zero risk position, which is it only takes on contractually that risk which it's already transferred to its insurance company. And, using third-party tools and vendor-developed tools creates complicated questions about liability and who's responsible, and all those things need to be carefully clarified in all the contracts.
So if it's possible, and I agree with you, and I think that more than agreeing with you, I would encourage the MSPs out there to listen to Rob's advice and attempt to get a fair and equitable set of terms with your vendors as much as possible. But where we see this becoming a challenge is when you have these MSP platform companies, and everybody knows this. If it's not explicitly known, then it's implicitly known. They're trying to grab market share, and they're trying to consolidate a homogenous managed services practice. What I mean by that is they want their MSP partners to be using everything from their stack, right? They all have an RMM, they all have a ticketing, they all have a security, they all have a backup solution, they've all got password management, right? They all have the basic fundamentals of an MSP practice from a tool standpoint, and they want you buying everything from them. Most MSP, well, I don't know most, but a lot of MSPs don't do that. They do a best of breed approach. And that is a challenge to their market share and to their bottom line and to their financial goals, especially those who are in the public market and have quarterly shareholder pressures and obligations. For everybody else, Rob, does that make how does that make a vendor who isn't publicly traded, who doesn't have a very big MSP portfolio business? How should they, if you were advising them today, how would you advise that vendor to approach the MSP market from a risk standpoint?
I think fundamentally, you have to be going to the market saying, I offer a solution that will work for you technically and will work for you from a business perspective. I'm going to leave the technical part off because the MSP wouldn't be doing the deal if it wasn't technically the right solution.
Right.
So, what I'm going to want to see from that vendor is that they're going to take responsibility for the failures of their tools and the failures of their people. And if they won't do that, then there's nothing for me to do. Because I'm not going to go put in a customer environment a tool that the vendor's not going to stand behind. It's really that simple. So if I'm a tool for managed services, I want my value proposition to be clear. I want to make it to where it fits with the business so that it scales up and down, and it's easy for the MSP to manage multiple accounts. And it's something that they can make money with. And when it comes to the contract, the MSP and the customer can be made whole for anything that is the fault of, and what I mean by fault of, I mean negligence, product failure, or intentional or willful misconduct. That can't be disclaimed, and the rights have to follow all the way through to the end user, whether that's through indemnity of the MSP or that's a direct end user license agreement. But the MSP has to understand not only the legal issues with it and the vendor, but also the corresponding legal issues that arise by virtue of using that tool in a customer environment.
Rob, do you believe that some vendors who are new to the MSP community, meaning they don't have a real mature MSP partner program, if they do have a channel program, it might be like a value-added reseller or general reseller partner program, but it's not specific or contemplating MSPs as part of that partner community? Do you think that there's a difference between the type of risk terms in those agreements with the partners if they're coming from a reseller standpoint versus a vendor who really understands the MSP market? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think there can be big differences. And the labels are less important than the substance. But the real issue is, who is the customer of the vendor? If the MSP is the customer of the vendor, then the end user has no contractual relationship with the vendor. That's not reselling,
No, it's not.
right? Reselling is I do a transaction where I sell you either a solution or a license, and you agree to pay me, and you sign up on the vendor's paper as an end user. That's reselling. Most MSPs don't resell. Most MSPs contract with vendors where they're the customer. And then the question is, how does the end user customer get covered if there's an issue with the vendor solution? Because they're the one that's most likely to be injured. So the tricky part is to make sure that in that scenario where there's no end user license agreement, that all of the legal issues get covered in the agreement between the MSP and the customer, and the MSP and the vendor's agreement makes it clear that the vendor is responsible to cover claims by customers, end user customers, related to the solution or any failure to perform on the part of the vendor. So it's complicated when you don't want to resell, and what you want to do is bundle solutions, which to me, the clear trend in the market is a bundled solution set that's not completely transparent to the customer, where the MSP signs the customer up for a generic set of services and has discretion to choose which tool sets it wants to execute the services.
Right. And I think that's been where the market's been heading for the last, better part of 20 years. I mean, that's where MSPs have been wanting to shed their reseller skins. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, does the vendor uninitiated with MSP partner programs, who may not even had to have had any risk terms embedded in their reseller partner agreements, they may be approaching this with, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, little or maybe no knowledge of the risk that's involved in the MSP with their customer, and therefore they may not be accustomed to having these types of conversations. I don't know if that's even happening in the market, but I sense that it is, because
I think there are certain tools that are viable tools that people are interested in that have been developed by what I'll refer to as relatively unsophisticated businesses when it comes to issues like international privacy laws and things like that. And so we have found ourselves, representing MSPs that want to do a vendor deal, and they send us the paper, and we wind up having to rewrite because
it wasn't in there.
It's missing so many of the required elements.
Right.
And my clients have shared with me that the reason that it's that way is that this is just not, this is just not an area that vendor has tons of experience with.
So maybe that's the first call out, right? Piece of advice when negotiating with vendors is figuring out whether you're dealing with an initiated or an uninitiated vendor. Meaning, are you dealing with a vendor that understands MSPs? Do they say that they understand, but they don't really? I think the agreement that Rob is talking about, right, is going to tell you a lot about whether or not they really understand your business model and whether they respect the risk that you take on. That seems like, Rob, a very first,
Charlie,
easy first.
here's the biggest tell. If you look at the license grant and it says something like, we're giving you a non-exclusive license to use the software, the solution solely for your internal business purposes, If you read that, then you know that you're in that uninitiated category.
Okay, and can you explain why in that phrase that
The
screams to
key is
you?
internal. The key is internal business purposes. MSPs don't deploy this software for their internal business purposes. They deploy it for their customer-facing operations. This is service enablement. This is not internal business purposes.
But it's also not reselling either, right? So it's different than internal. It's not reselling. It's something else.
Exact needs to be very clear.
Right.
What is the license? What is it for? How do we count? How do we segregate customers? If one customer breaches the terms and conditions, does that mean you could turn all customers off or just that one? So a number of things that are unique to managed services. And in my experience, the vendor agreements don't cover the nuances necessary to give protection, adequate protection to the MSP, and sometimes not adequate protection to the end user.
Now, let's talk about the end user, because obviously an astute MSP is going to be not only looking out for their own risk and their own skin, but they're also going to be paying attention to the risk to their customers. What, in your opinion, Rob, would be some of those telltale signs of risk in that vendor agreement to the managed service provider's customer?
The vendor agreement says you're responsible for all use of the tool. You waive the right to bring any claims. You acknowledge that your customers have no arranged relationship with us. We limit our liability to a small amount of money based on what you pay us, regardless of whether we blew something up that we should stand behind. So a lot of it is about, if it comes across as very one-sided, and if it doesn't clearly articulate a basis through which end users recover for legitimate claims, then you have a problem, because no prudent MSP should put a customer into a technology platform where the customer has no recourse. Because, my MSP clients, we're telling the end user, we deliver the services through a variety of third-party solutions, and we're not responsible if a third-party solution doesn't perform. We're passing on what rights you would have if you dealt direct.
So it just to pause there, Rob, under that scenario that you just mentioned, the client rights that you would want to preserve as the MSP would be, I use vendor brand X for my network monitoring management. Vendor brand tool gets hacked through no fault of my own. I didn't do anything. It was something happened on their end, whether it was their fault or not, but it happened to them. And then if I'm the MSP in this scenario, my MSP customer is harmed. My agreement should say, it wasn't me. I know it wasn't you. It wasn't your fault, but it's not my fault. So my insurance isn't going to cover this. But this guy over here, vendor X, he's the one that you need to go after. That's what you're talking about that needs to be in that agreement.
Correct. There has to be a contractual path, either through an end user license agreement wherein the customer has direct rights, or through indemnity, where the MSP can secure the ability for that client in that situation to recover from the vendor or its insurance company.
So, Rob, we're seeing a lot of stuff. The way I'm listening to you describe this, it's almost like this is an insult to the customer, because it's really the vendor saying, it's like, remember the old Cisco contracts, right? Everybody who's been around the industry remembers, kind of the nature of Cisco, which was, hey, you're the reseller or the MSP, we really own the customer, right? If you don't perform, we can move you, the reseller, out of the way, and we will take over, or we can redesignate them to another partner. And those days, were very scary for MSPs, and a lot of people didn't like those days. Today, you're talking about a very different scenario from those kind of typical Cisco contracts, which are, we don't even want to know what the customer is. We don't care what the customer is doing, but guess what? We don't want any blowback. They're your customer. It's your problem. Even if it's our problem, it's your problem.
Yes, I think you nailed it, Charles. It's a much different approach to the channel. And I think if Cisco actually had this approach, it would have worked better.
Wait, go back. If Cisco had which approach, it would have gone better.
The approach you're talking about, where it's let the MSP own the customer relationship. I mean, there's no reason that the vendors should be owning the MSP's customer relationship. That's threatening the MSP. That's why they were pissed about Cisco.
Well, if any of you are wondering what we're talking about, I'm pretty sure it was I know it was a case. I don't know how far it went. I thought it went fully through a decision, and then maybe it got appealed. But it was I think in and around San Francisco, or definitely on the West Coast. It involved an MSP who had their contract terminated with Cisco and a client, and Cisco basically took the customer and said, you, the MSP, aren't performing, and they gave the customer contract to another partner, another MSP, and the original MSP sued. And I should probably look up that case. But yeah, those were the days when, it wasn't just Cisco, but that was kind of like the standard, par for the course behavior of vendor to the MSP. And I don't think anyone wants those days back. But Rob, you're saying hands off the MSP customer, but not hands off the shared reasonable liability that you as a vendor have. So basically own your technology.
Yeah, we look, nobody's asking them to be the insurer of everything that can happen, right? But you do need to stand behind your own negligent acts, your own willful misconduct, and failure of the system to comply, to perform in accordance with the documentation. When your network is the one that gets breached and requires MSPs to give notice to their customers that could give rise to a notice obligation under privacy and security laws, it should be clear that the vendor has to pay for that.
If an MSP encounters this type of an agreement and they suspect, but maybe they don't know, maybe they see it and they say, okay, well, it says something that Rob said I shouldn't do. What do? They just call you up and say, hey, Rob, can you and the team give a quick read through on this? And I mean, do you do that?
Look, I want to preface this by saying that with these contracts, like with every contract, the party's willingness to negotiate on terms and conditions is multi-factor, but it generally involves leverage. And so I don't want to give the impression that every startup MSP has got enough bargaining leverage to start, demanding that vendors rewrite their agreements. That being said, if you're an established MSP and you're spending or contemplating spending any significant sums with a vendor, it does make sense to have an attorney that understands your business to review them and negotiate them for you in certain circumstances where privacy and security or other high stakes issues are in play, either significant income or significant risk to the customer.
Yeah. Rob, I don't want to throw gasoline onto this fire, but it's not like we don't have MSPs calling us up. A lot of them, most of them members, and they're just saying, "Hey, look, you should be aware of this behavior that we're seeing, and it's not good behavior. What could we do?" And I think that your point on leverage is an important one because most MSPs think and negotiate in a vacuum. And I'm wondering if it's just time, and I'm wondering how to do this other than just to come out there and say it, which is the MSP, the vendors who sell to MSPs want more MSPs. And if more MSPs stopped in the negotiation process and said, "I'm not going to sign this," I wonder if it wouldn't have an immediate effect by having some of those contract templates start to change. And maybe the first step is, Rob, getting someone like you involved in saying, "Okay, this has to go, right? Change this, and then you will have a good agreement that is fair to you, the MSP, and to your customer that you represent."
Well,
wishful thinking, or
interesting concept, but just to be clear, I would not be reviewing any vendor contracts related to MSPs, other than in a specific engagement where I'm representing a specific party.
Understand.
And what you're referring to is more the power of the network and the need for the members to respond to market conditions. Somewhat separate, the legal part of it, we're certainly here to help and do the negotiations and point out the issues that are of concern. But that leverage issue is a function of a number of different things, right? And what the market and what the members are thinking is important and should be communicated.
But Rob, I hear what you're saying, and I'm not trying to stoke these fires, but I am saying that I think the vendors may not understand how much resistance is mounting to these tactics. And I'm also saying that if the vendors took a little time, listened to this podcast, replay it a few times, sent it to their legal counsel, paid attention to the words that you said, Rob, and made some of those subtle changes in their agreements with these MSPs, it might actually generate some goodwill and help them close more business. Because right now, I'm seeing the MSPs starting to wake up and say, "You know what? I don't really feel like signing this agreement because it doesn't feel right. It's not equitable." And that's all I'm seeing.
So the next question becomes, okay, so I'm not going to sign it. Now what? I need an alternative.
You need an alternative.
What does the alternative agreement look like?
You go to the other big three, and they have the same exact agreement, most likely, which doesn't help you. And then you go to the secondary and maybe the tertiary markets and start looking at their tools.
I think, Charlie, it would be interesting exercise for us to look at the big three and compare them. I'm not so sure you're right that they're all identical.
You think there could be big differences.
I would bet you all the adult beverages that you could drink in one evening at the ranch house, and I'll pay for your ticket to get there, that they're not all three identical.
All right. So,
or you just mentioned the other three. I'm saying if we took 4 big RMM vendor contracts and created a grid of the important terms, it would be interesting to see how they line up. I'm gonna get one of my legal beagles to jump on that, and I'll share the results with you, and we'll discuss it because at the end of the day, people hate Oracle too, and they hate IBM, and they hate all the big companies.
Yeah,
but they stay. Why?
The product's
because
good.
The product is entrenched. It may not even be good. but it's there.
Fair enough.
Very expensive to replace. And so, software companies are not necessarily measured on, how liked they are by their customers. In fact, in some ways, software companies are becoming more like utilities. How many people like the customer service at the phone company or the utility company?
Good point.
So I think for us to expect that, software vendors and even those with service enablement tools are going to act as good corporate citizens and provide, what we would now consider old school customer support, I'm not so sure that's the right way to be thinking about their role.
Well, you could be right, and I would certainly love to see the results of that comparison of the 3 or 4 different kind of platform vendor contracts, and maybe we'll do a future MSP Zone episode on that. But just to tidy up and summarize today's kind of concept, I would suggest, and I think Rob's advice bears this out, which is you, the MSP, do have recourse. You do have leverage, and I would recommend that you use it. And it doesn't mean that you have to, be radicalized in terms of how you approach and negotiate with your vendors. But I think that the more of you who start to say, wait, hold on, I'm not just going to rubber stamp this and sign this agreement like I always have, and you start to dig into those terms that Rob highlighted, I think that that's going to be good for you, and it's going to be good for your customer, and you're going to avoid potentially a lot of problems down the road. That's my takeaway. Rob, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
I think you summarized it great. I mean, that's really what we're trying to say, is that you may have more wiggle room than you think. And either way, you've got to get down and understand, how you're protecting your customer.
Very well said. Yeah. So hope this helps, everyone. If you have maybe some stories to share with us, we'd love to have you on with Rob and myself on a future MSP Zone episode. Send an email to mspzone@mspalliance.com. Until then, Rob, stay safe and good luck with your supply chain problems as Texas opens. And to all of you out there,
I'm a made man down here, Charlie, so I don't worry about supply.
Well said. For the rest of you, stay safe. And until next time, this is Charles Weaver with the MSP Zone.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a like. Make sure you are subscribed to the podcast so you will get notified when future episodes are released. We will see you next time in the MSP Zone.